I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. Throughout the history of the United States, many commanders-in-chief knew each other, and their lives intersected in a number of ways. Sometimes their political and personal interactions would result in conflict, and other times in harmony. However, in some instances, relationships developed into strong personal friendships and mutually beneficial political alliances. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, our guest is presidential historian and author Mike Purdy. Mike's book, Presidential Friendships: How They Changed History, examines the friendships of Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon B. Johnson. Mike gives insight into the lives and personalities of these two sets of presidents and explains how political ambition, mutual respect, and conflict shaped their friendships and changed the course of history. Mike's vast knowledge of presidential history brings these four men back to life and helps us to understand the importance of communication and respect, both in government and within our own personal lives. I'd now like to welcome Mike Purdy to our show. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you for having me, James. I appreciate it.
Well, it's an honor to have a distinguished presidential historian on our podcast. You've written a tremendous book in presidential friendships and how they changed history. Tremendous book, but you've also written another book. It's called 101 Presidential Insults and what they really thought about each other and what it means to us. I think that's a cool book that I'd really like to get a hold of and talk to you about another time.
Yeah, it's a fun little book. I wrote that because, I've been aware over time of all these relationships between presidents. And I thought, well, sometimes they've said nasty things about one another. And I thought, given the times that we were living in and are living in now, that it would be fun to highlight those and set the context for them, but also to talk about the importance of civility in not only personal relationships, but in the public square. So that's kind of a little bit behind the 101 Presidential Insults.
Well, the book we're going to talk about today is the one about presidential friendships, and I think that's a really cool topic. How did you become a presidential historian? What does one do to become a presidential historian?
Well, I think there's a lot of different routes that people take. I've probably taken an unorthodox route. Many people will study in college history. Many presidential historians are academics, and they are professors at colleges and universities. I chose to study business and public administration in college, and then later went and both at undergraduate and graduate level, I got an MBA. And then I later went back and got a Master of Divinity degree from Fuller Theological Seminary. And the whole topic of presidential history has been something that has been near and dear to my heart my whole life. I mean, ever since I was an 8-year-old kid, and I read all the presidential biographies in my elementary school library in Princeton, New Jersey. I had posted on my walls of my bedroom the U.S. Treasury engraving printings, the portraits of all the presidents. My dad bought those for me. I put them up on my walls in order of presidential terms of office and memorized the presidential order, devoured this little book called Facts About the Presidents by Joseph Nathan Cain. And so it's been a lifelong interest of mine. And throughout the years, I've read many presidential biographies. So when I retired after 30 years working for government agencies as a contracting manager, I did some consulting work in that same area for about 10 years. But I also decided during that time I was doing consulting that I really wanted to pursue this passion and interest in presidential history more. And a couple of things kind of came together about the same time. I developed a website, presidentialhistory.com. In the 2016 presidential campaign, which was obviously a very unusual and unprecedented campaign, I gave a series of lectures at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, where I had graduated from. And somehow through that and other means, I ended up getting the attention of the media. So I ended up being interviewed and still am interviewed by the media about presidential history and politics. And this whole concept of reading about the presidents over time and realizing that so many of them knew one another. And sometimes those relationships were good, and sometimes they were not quite as good. And sometimes it burned hot and cold. I mean, they were, friends and then enemies, and sometimes there were reconciliations. I've always been fascinated by the personal relationships and how do we humanize these men who have served as president. And so part of that was that first book that we talked about, 101 Presidential Insults. But then I began to think, okay, I really want to tell the story of some of these relationships. My dream has been to do a comprehensive book on presidential friendships, and maybe I would need to call it Presidential Friendships and Feuds, because, there's a lot of those as well. But I thought, just given the time that I have in this season of life, I thought I want to get out what I have already done a lot of research on and the writing on, and thus Presidential Friendships, how they changed history.
Well, we're going to talk about that book in a second, but I wanted to say one thing is that I've always loved studying the presidents. I don't know what it was about the presidents, but that particularly drew me to them. But I think for me, it was that each one sort of represented a time in history. So when you study the presidents, you're studying a period in American history through the life of someone who was in charge and lived during those times. And you kind of see it through their life. I think that was what was so cool about, studying the presidents all the way from George Washington and the powdered wigs all the way to the current day. And that's why I liked it. What drew you to the president? Was the same thing, studying presidents?
I think so. I think the fact that, for many people, history is a boring subject. And you talk to people and they say, oh, I had to take history in high school and college and I hated it. But history is human drama, and it is relationships. And as we understand that it's not just a series of facts and dates, but it is this human drama. And we end up learning about, okay, what drove some of these major historical events of the times that these men lived in, and how do we tell those stories in the context of these men, and in particular, here in this book, in the context of their relationships and how those relationships ended up having a significant impact on how things turned out.
Yeah, so let's look at your book. There were two sets of presidential friendships that you zeroed in on in your book. The first pair is Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And the second is Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Let's start with Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. Tell us about the personalities of these two men. Let's start with Teddy Roosevelt.
Sure. So first of all, their personalities could not be more different. They were as different as night and day, which is one of the fascinating things about their friendship then, that they were so different. Theodore Roosevelt was this mass of energy, and he was driven, he was energetic, he wanted to do good. Theodore Roosevelt also had a huge ego. And as we'll find out as we talk about this relationship, I believe it's his ego that really ended up being what caused the friendship between Taft and Theodore Roosevelt to fall apart. So while on the one hand, Roosevelt is this dynamic, outgoing, the strenuous life type of person. You've got Taft, who is reserved. He has a judicial mindset. He's deliberative, whereas Roosevelt thinks out loud. There's actually a comment on this in the book. After Taft goes to Washington, D.C. to work as Roosevelt's Secretary of War, he writes that, I wish the president wouldn't think out loud so much. Because that's what Roosevelt did. He just, again, this massive energy. And so Taft is much more reserved. All he ever wants in life is to be a judge. All he ever wants in life is to be on the Supreme Court. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to be president early on. So they both had these aspirations. When we look at the relationship between the two men, Theodore Roosevelt was the idea generator, and Taft was the implementer. So when Taft served as Secretary of War for Roosevelt, they got along famously. It was actually the first time in their lives that they had actually worked together professionally. But they got along great. Roosevelt had the ideas. Taft is fearless, and he goes out and implements those ideas, but he's not necessarily the idea man himself.
Yes. And I think in the book, you mentioned that TR pretty much felt that Taft was a real good lieutenant, but as the leader, he didn't shine so much. But didn't TR really make Taft's presidency?
He did. He made Taft president. And we'll talk about that in a second, but I want to go back to your comment about that he was a good lieutenant. Taft was a good lieutenant. In some ways, I think Theodore Roosevelt would have said that about anybody. Nobody could quite measure up to who he was. You could have picked any other person, and Theodore Roosevelt would have been disappointed with their presidency because they would not have been an exact clone of Roosevelt. Roosevelt would comment during the campaign when 1908, when Taft is running for president, that by electing Taft, you're essentially continuing on a third Roosevelt term because they're identical. No two men in public life have more in common. These are Roosevelt's words. It wasn't true. He was really deluded by that. And I think part of what was behind that was the fact that Roosevelt realized he made a mistake on election night in 1904 when he said he would not run for re-election. And we can get to that part later. I don't want to jump ahead of the story there, but yeah.
I remember studying Roosevelt, reading some books on him in the past, how, he had this tremendous president, this larger than life person, big ego, brilliant man, historian, a naturalist. This guy had so many credentials, energy, abounding energy, but his ego really did seem to get the better of him. And I think you had mentioned in the book that Roosevelt said that he most regretted making the statement that he would not run for a third term. I know I've read about Roosevelt before and I admire him greatly, but that is something I struggle with when I read that he just barreled over a friendship. He went against his promise because his ego just was boundless.
Right. And I think something changed for Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 and the years after. I think he was, as you commented, a very good president, a very dynamic president. And certainly he had the ego then, but I don't think it got in the way. I think it started to get in the way after his presidency and some of the breakdown of the friendship with Taft. Like you said, he allowed his ego to barrel over that friendship. And he simply could not stand not being the center of attention. His daughter, Alice, famously said that, her father wanted to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. And he simply has to be at the center. So when his presidency is over, and he loved every minute of his presidency, he is at loose ends. He's 50 years old. What's the encore? What's he going to do? And so he essentially picks a fight with Taft as a way to get back into the limelight.
Yeah, you mentioned about his age. He was only 50 years old when he left office. He was just, I guess, just over 50 years old. That Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest man to become president, correct?
That is correct. 42 years old when he became president after McKinley was assassinated in 1901.
So you have this man with this incredible amount of energy, knowledge. Now he's got the experience. He loves running things, and he's only just broken 50 years old. And he's hardly ready to just sort of kick back and stay out of the limelight, right?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So, after his presidency, he goes on this African safari. He's recognized by many different countries on this, and this is a huge ego boost for him. But he comes back and he's not happy with Taft. And so let's talk about what happened with that friendship. But maybe before we do, maybe we should talk about the foundations of that friendship first and how far it fell. So in the early 1890s, William Howard Taft became Solicitor General in Washington, D.C. So that's the position that represents the government's viewpoints to the Supreme Court. Theodore Roosevelt had been appointed to the Civil Service Commission in D.C. And Taft gets to D.C. and he is like a fish out of water. He goes, I've made a huge mistake. I shouldn't have given up the judicial bench in Ohio. This is a big mistake. Washington is just this big place where I don't know anybody. And somehow these two men meet very early on. And I don't know exactly when they first met, but it was early on they met. They lived within a half a mile of each other in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, D.C. They frequently walked together to work. So I can imagine them walking together. They're talking politics, they're talking careers, they're talking about their dreams, they're talking about their families. They go to their offices, and then frequently lunchtime would come and they would get together for lunch and continue the conversation. So they're very good personal friends. And throughout their careers, they help one another move to the next step. So after Taft's duty as Solicitor General, he was offered a position as a federal judge back in Ohio. He grabbed at the opportunity. He goes back. Roosevelt's still in Washington as Civil Service Commissioner, but eventually lands a job as New York City Police Commissioner. Roosevelt is there for a couple of years, and he's started to burn his bridges there. It's just becoming an untenable political situation for him. Taft comes into town and visits. They talk. And Roosevelt says, hey, you know what? I would really like to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, there's a couple problems with that. There was a Democrat already in that office at the time, and Roosevelt's only chance of getting that position would be if a Republican won the presidency in 1896. So in 1896, Roosevelt ends up campaigning for William McKinley and hoping that McKinley will take notice of him. But he also goes to Taft and said, would you talk to McKinley? They're both from Ohio. Would you talk to McKinley and see, if he wins, and once he's won, would you talk to him about appointing me to Assistant Secretary of the Navy? Taft does it. Roosevelt has other people who are trying to lobby President-elect McKinley. McKinley does not have a favorable impression of Roosevelt at all. He thinks he's too much of a warmonger and a little bit unstable. Eventually, McKinley is convinced. Roosevelt gets the job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and it's not just a a position that he thinks, okay, I'd like to have this position. Well, when he was in his 20s, Roosevelt wrote what is still the definitive work of the Naval War of 1812. So he became this expert. So he had some credentials. So then Roosevelt is in that position for a year or so. The Spanish-American War comes up. He volunteers to fight in it. He has this famous moment on San Juan Hill. He becomes a war hero, which propels him into the governorship of New York State. And from there, he becomes McKinley's vice presidential candidate in 1900. All of this happens within like a 4-year period of time. So Roosevelt is vice president. McKinley is trying to figure out what to do about the Philippine Islands, how to govern them. And he says, we need a governor general. And Roosevelt, always the man with plenty of ideas of what should happen, he ends up saying, I know the perfect man for this job. And that's William Howard Taft, this judge in Ohio. And we should mention, too, that Taft had great political pedigree. His father, Alphonso Taft, was Secretary of War under Ulysses Grant. And Alphonso Taft's lifelong dream had been to sit on the Supreme Court, and he never made that. So Taft is convinced by Roosevelt to enter the world stage, become Governor General of the Philippines. Within a few months, McKinley's been assassinated. Roosevelt becomes president, and there becomes a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Roosevelt, knowing from his earlier friendship with Taft, knows that that's his lifelong dream, goes to Taft and says, I want to appoint you. Taft surprisingly says no. It was an agonizing decision for him, and there were a number of factors that went into it. One factor is that Taft said, there's still work to be done here in the Philippines, and I need to complete that. But kind of the backstory is Taft's wife, Nellie, who was very politically ambitious and wanted her husband to be president. And she was afraid that if he sat on the Supreme Court, he would never become president. So why was Nellie Taft so set on her husband becoming president? Well, when she was a teenager, she had visited the Rutherford Hayes White House with her father and had been so impressed with all the glitz and glitter and glamour. And she made a vow to herself then that she would never marry any man who did not have the potential to become president. So she could move back to the White House. and so that's what's driving it. So Taft says no to this Supreme Court appointment, the thing that he wants most in his life. Agonizing decision. Then a few months later, there's a second opening on the Supreme Court. President Roosevelt again goes to his friend and says, another opening, I want to appoint you. Taft agonizes over this all over again and says no. Roosevelt's a little bit peeved by this because he was the president. He knows best about where people should be. And this was kind of an affront to his ego, an affront to his authority. And so Taft turns down the Supreme Court a second time. A little bit of time goes on, and there's an opening for Secretary of War. Roosevelt says, I've got to bring you back from the Philippines. You need to be Secretary of War. So a few things have changed. One, Taft's health was not good, and he needed to get away. Secondly, as Secretary of War, he could still supervise the Philippines indirectly. And thirdly, Nellie Taft thought that that was a better job for him. There's this quote from Nellie Taft, and I included in the book, that she says years later about his appointment as Secretary of War. She says, and this is a quote from Nellie Taft, that the Secretary of War position was in line with the kind of work I wanted my husband to do, the kind of career I wanted for him and expected him to have. So that is Nellie Taft's control over her husband.
Wow. When you think that he turned down two separate Supreme Court potential appointments because his wife had higher aspirations for him to be president, to fulfill her childhood dream.
Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, this is fascinating. So you think about the human dynamics that are going on here and how absent that, Taft would have become a Supreme Court justice in his 40s, probably would have eventually become Chief Justice, as he did, in fact, later on, after Warren Harding appointed him to that position after his presidency. But how would that have changed history, in terms of Taft likely would never have become president? There's this funny, humorous scene that occurs in the White House one time, and the Roosevelts were entertaining the Tafts for dinner, and the president was in a jovial mood, and he says something to the effect that, I see a slender thread hanging, and I can't make it out whether it's the presidency or the chief justiceship. And Nellie Taft chimes in and she says, "Oh, make it the presidency." And Taft says, "Oh, make it the chief justiceship." And so Roosevelt is casting about, trying to figure out who his successor is going to be, who he's going to anoint, because he's given up this opportunity to run for essentially a third term. And eventually Roosevelt says that he wants Taft to succeed him. This is a nightmare for Taft. The thought of a national campaign is a nightmare. The thought of being president is a nightmare. He doesn't have the personality of Roosevelt. He's not charismatic. He's jovial. He's a very nice man, but he's not intense like Roosevelt. He doesn't have an intense agenda. He's got the mind of a judge. So you've got these points along the timeline where these two men help one another in their careers. And there's actually a third time later where there's another Supreme Court vacancy when Taft is Secretary of War, and Taft says the same thing. He says no. And again, Roosevelt's not all too happy with that. So you've got this very warm friendship that was built from their time as young men in their 30s in Washington, D.C. You've got them working together, helping each other in their careers. You've got them working together in the Roosevelt administration. And then you've got the big break in the friendship, the tragic break. And what happens is, I think there's a couple of factors. One is after Taft wins the election in 1908, with Roosevelt's full support and endorsement and campaigning, Taft writes a thank you letter to Roosevelt, which is appropriate. But Taft was not a political animal, and he was a little bit politically obtuse. So he writes this letter to Roosevelt saying, thank you. And he says that you and my brother Charlie had the most to do with me becoming president.
Uh-oh.
And my brother Charlie. Had he left out those words, things may have turned out differently, but Roosevelt was incensed. How dare he say that his brother Charlie is at the same level as the president who handed the presidency to Taft on a silver platter, which he did. What his brother Charlie had done was help raise money. It took Taft a couple of years to figure out that he had made a blunder. But Roosevelt was pretty unhappy with that comment. His ego couldn't handle it. He comes back from his African safari after his presidency. He sees Taft making decisions that he would not have made, and he realizes that he's not a political clone. He's his own man. He's the president. And he starts to get agitated, both by the decisions that Taft is making, by this insensitive letter that Taft has written, and by the fact that Roosevelt does not know what to do with the rest of his life. And he's not at the center of attention, and he's got to figure out how to become the center of attention again. Thus he challenges Taft for the 1912 Republican nomination, loses, and then Roosevelt bolts, forms the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, runs against him. Taft in 1912, three-way race, including Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. Taft ends up with 8 electoral votes. He comes in third place in this election. So Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote and put Wilson in the White House. So again, a point of we can ask the what if question. Had that not happened, would Wilson ever have become president? And how would that have changed history?
Oh, yes. When I read that letter, the part of the letter that offended TR, I was like shocked. I'm thinking this caused him to really turn against a long-term friend because he didn't get the only praise in the letter. I was so shocked. And I know Taft probably should have known better because he knew Teddy Roosevelt had a huge ego. I'm sure he knew that as his friend. But the fact he included his brother, that it caused such a huge problem for Teddy. That shocked me in some ways, but the more I've read about Roosevelt, it really didn't shock me as much because I think you had mentioned probably the bigger issue was he didn't know what to do with himself and he had to be the head honcho. He had to be the man. He was the man already, and he wanted to continue in that role. So in order to elevate himself, he had to press down on his former friend and competitor now for history and the head position in the country.
I think that's very well said. And I think that 1912 is this dividing line in Theodore Roosevelt's life. And, he kind of lost it a little bit after that. And a lot of less than desirable traits came to the forefront much more then.
It is sad. And then, of course, I know late in life, they did have a somewhat of a reconciliation. I know Teddy Roosevelt's son Quentin was killed in air battle during World War One, and Taft had sent his sympathies, and
Yes.
that was helpful, I'm sure. But it was never entirely the way it was before, though, was
It never was. They had this limited reconciliation, as you mentioned, the Taft note to Roosevelt after Quentin died. And there were a few occasions where they got together. But after all the things they said about one another, and Taft got into the fray in the 1912 campaign, he didn't want to, but he's being attacked pretty viciously by Roosevelt. And I've always maintained that the 1912 presidential election prior to 2016 was the most vicious presidential campaign we've ever had. And so Roosevelt was leading the charge on that viciousness. Taft had his own share of zingers about Roosevelt, and even Woodrow Wilson jumped into it.
yeah. And then what I noted was that, Teddy Roosevelt was a man always, when he was a young child, I know was very sickly, but he became a very robust adult because of, sheer determination and willpower. And he was just, he built himself up physically. And, Taft was very overweight. As you mentioned, he had some health problems in the Philippines. And yet Teddy Roosevelt died quite young, didn't he?
He died at 60, which was a really big shock for everybody because he was considered a potential candidate for the Republican nomination in 1820. And, he may have, in fact, won that. So it is interesting, to think about the comparison of their health. Taft lived, I think, to be 73, and here's this very overweight man versus the robust Rough Rider who dies young. So it's very interesting how those things turned out.
Yeah, and you had mentioned in the book that Taft cried during funeral for his old friend, didn't he?
He did, and he commented that he could never have lived with himself if there had not been some kind of reconciliation with Roosevelt, and there was enough that was good, but their friendship was never what it was before. They burned way too many bridges in 1912 for that to ever be totally recovered as a friendship, which is sad, I think.
Yeah. When I think of these two men, and if I could get into a time machine and go back and meet both of them, I think that I would love to meet Teddy Roosevelt, to sit and talk with Teddy Roosevelt. But I think as far as a friend, I think I would really like to be friends with William Howard Taft because it sounds like he was just, as you mentioned, a nice guy.
Exactly, exactly. And I think as we look at the story of these two men, the quick way to characterize it is that Taft was more interested in the friendship and Roosevelt was more interested in his career. Or to put it more concisely, the big heart versus the big ego. And that's kind of how it played out.
Well, this is a good transition point to our next study of friends, two big, huge personalities, and they are Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Let's start with FDR. Who was FDR? What was he like as a person and a politician leader?
Well, FDR has this patrician background. He wants to emulate his fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. He is a very savvy and wily political leader. People would go away from meeting him as president and they would say, "Oh, he agrees with me." FDR had this smile on his face always, but you could never really get a read on what he really thought. And it was a challenge for people to figure that out. Many people, including Harry Truman, his fourth vice president, said that FDR, was one of the coldest men he ever met. Which is interesting because you get this sense of him in public of he's always smiling, even though he might be in great pain because of his paralysis, and he's trying to make it look like he's walking, but he's always trying to put people at ease. But he's always kind of rearranging the pieces on the chessboard, and he knows what he wants. He is the ultimate power player, and he knows how to exercise the levers of power and wants to do it. And he's not particularly concerned about ethics. And in that sense, he and Lyndon Johnson have a lot in common, which is why they liked one another. One reason, I think, that both of them were driven by power, and both of them were willing to bend the rules. Now, it's interesting as we look at the foursome that are talked about in this book, we've got FDR and LBJ, who are power players, and you could say the same about Theodore Roosevelt, but William Howard Taft is not in that mix. He's not a driven power player. But clearly that is what Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt are.
Now, LBJ, let's talk about him now. He's very different in many ways than FDR. I mean, where he was born in the hills.
Hill country of Texas, very poor area. Yeah.
Very poor area of Texas. And he was much younger than FDR. I think Johnson was born in like 1908 and FDR
Correct.
1882, I think it was.
Right. Uh-huh.
Almost father-son age group, I would imagine.
Exactly.
And Johnson, I remember Johnson being president. So it was so interesting to hear about his early days and how he became the person, this very powerful being, this personality that sort of took over the room and, was able to get a hold of people and get in their face and get what he wanted out of them, basically. And yet he was up against FDR, who again was another person who had this tremendous ability to work on and with people and the two of them sort of came together. How did they get to know each other?
Well, they first actually met, and I just want to go back for a second and make a comment about LBJ's background. And we talked about the born in the hill country of Texas, poor. He wants out of there. He wants to make a name for himself. He wants to be president at an early age in his teenage years. And LBJ has this incredible ability to either create or find the power vacuum in any situation. And again, sometimes by unscrupulous means to capitalize on that. So, LBJ's career, after he did some teaching, he was appointed as secretary to a newly elected congressman in Texas. And the congressman preferred to play golf and go to parties, which was great for Johnson because he could then become the power behind the throne. And he did that. But he didn't just want to be a congressional secretary. He wanted to be more. So then there's a New Deal agency created, the National Youth Administration. They need a Texas statewide director. Johnson says, I want that job. So he pulls out all the stops, all his connections, the Texas senators, Sam Rayburn, who had been friends with Johnson's father. And Sam Rayburn goes to the White House and tries to convince FDR to appoint this skinny hick from Texas to the job. Johnson is, 26 years old maybe then, maybe younger. He has no administrative experience. He doesn't know the president. This is an uphill battle. But somehow Rayburn was successful, and he convinced the president to appoint Johnson sight unseen to the statewide Texas directorship of the National Youth Administration. Side story, there had already been somebody appointed to that position and sworn in, and that was all covered up as, oh, that's a mistake. And so Johnson does that for a couple of years, and then the congressman in the 10th district in Texas dies suddenly. And Johnson decides he's going to run for that office. He resigns from the directorship of the National Youth Administration in Texas to focus on running for Congress. His platform is support for FDR, all of FDR's programs, including the ill-fated court packing scheme. And so he is all in for the president. So nationally, this is viewed as a referendum on the president. Johnson campaigns hard. He collapses 2 days before Election Day, has to have his appendix removed. He's in the hospital. He's weak. But he wins the election, gets twice the number of votes of any other candidate. He's still recuperating and finds out that FDR is going on a fishing trip off the coast of Texas. And so he talks to his contacts, who happens to be the governor of Texas, and they arrange for FDR and LBJ to meet. And so LBJ is waiting at the end of the dock when Roosevelt, propels himself down the plank, holding on to each side, so it looks like he's mobile. And the two men shake hands. And there's a picture that, memorializes this. And the governor of Texas is standing between them, which in later years Johnson didn't like, so he had him airbrushed out. And so they start talking, and LBJ is not willing to let this opportunity go. So he keeps trying to engage the president, but there's other people who want to talk to FDR. FDR likes this young boy. And he's the young boy who's campaigned fully supporting the Roosevelt administration. So he invites Johnson to join him on a 300-mile train trip from Galveston to Fort Worth that day. LBJ is, in his element. Private conversations with the president. He kind of exaggerates some things and stretches some truth, but he keeps the conversation going. But at the end of the trip, he's clearly worried. And he goes, I don't know if, this was a two-way street, whether the president really enjoyed it. And then as the last act, Roosevelt gets a paper and pencil and scribbles down a phone number and a name and says, here, when you get back to Washington, call Tommy Corcoran, my assistant, and he'll help you with whatever you need.
I'm thinking that Johnson is this young kid from Texas that he just has a nose for being in the right place at the right time, very intentionally, to get in good with the power of Washington, D.C., the man, the president. Didn't he have aspirations of being president like right off the bat?
Yeah.
Yeah. So FDR and LBJ started to rub some more elbows, and they started to help each other, didn't they, in many ways? Could you elaborate on that a drop?
Yeah. So they definitely helped each other. Shortly after Johnson was elected to Congress, one of his first goals was he wanted to bring electricity to the Hill Country. So this is the 1930s. So Johnson was elected in 37. And so he goes to try to get a loan from the Rural Electrification Administration, federal agency. He's turned down. They don't meet the regulations. They don't have enough signatures on the petition. There's not enough population density per mile. He goes to the director of the administration, Rural Electrification Administration. He strikes out there. So he pulls his ace in the hand there, and he gets an appointment with President Roosevelt. Now, keep in mind, they haven't seen each other since April of 1937, when they met right after Johnson's election. And this is now probably June of 1938. And he gets an appointment with FDR. And FDR is this master filibusterer, and it was part of his strategy so that people couldn't pin him down. So Johnson goes in and he tries to start talking about how he needs to bring electricity there. He talks about a certain type of dam and shows him some pictures, and Roosevelt starts waxing eloquent about these multiple arch dams and saying, that's the biggest one I've ever seen, and goes on and on and on and on. Johnson's aware his time is coming up in the appointment. He finally interrupts the president or gets a word in edgewise and gets his attention that, there's no electricity here, and we've got to bring it in. That strikes a chord with FDR. He gets on the phone. He calls the administrator of the Rural Electrification Administration, and he says, we need to do this. And he listens then on the other end of the line that, nope, there's lots of regulations and you can't do it. And FDR says, well, I know you've got regulations and you have to comply with those, but, I've got my good and old friend here, Lyndon Johnson, old friend. They've met once before, okay? So just do this for me. Put it on my account. Johnson gets the electricity to the Hill Country because he appealed to the president, and the president was willing to bend the rules.
Wow. I tell you, LBJ was a brilliant tactician, political tactician, wasn't he?
Oh, yes.
From a young age, the fact that he went in there and he knew he couldn't talk over FDR because FDR had the stage, but he was able to just slip that in right, and he knew what to say, and just enough to get the president's ear to get him to stop and actually make it happen. So kudos to LBJ.
Exactly. It's amazing. Other places where they've helped each other in their careers, in 1940 was a critical year for both of them, and they both helped each other a lot then. FDR is planning to run for re-election. It doesn't look real good. The Democrats think they're going to lose 50 seats in the House. Johnson, through a whole series of actions with the president and others, tries to get himself appointed to help raise money for congressional Democrats. He's finally given an informal role at doing that, kind of at the last hour. He moves into action quickly. He raises lots of money. How does he do that? Well, he has this agreement with the construction company, Brown and Root. And they have said, We're there for you, whatever you need, whenever you need it. So Johnson then distributes all this Brown and Root money to Democratic candidates, 1940 election, which in turn brings out the Democratic vote, which in fact helps Roosevelt win a third term. Without Johnson's efforts at fundraising, albeit somewhat illegal, FDR could have lost. So there you got Johnson kind of returning the favor. Johnson returned the favor before then also, where he ended up essentially serving as a double agent, where he's in the Texas congressional delegation. The vice president, John Nance Garner, is making noises about running for president. Garner and Roosevelt are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. They don't like each other. So Johnson finds this vacuum, this power vacuum, and he starts feeding information to the White House about what is talked about in the Texas delegation about Garner's aspirations. So he's playing a dangerous game here, but the White House is very indebted to him for this. And as a result, they end up giving him control over contracts in Texas, not to the senators, not to the senior members of the delegation. And because he has control of the contracts, who does he give them to? Brown and Root, who then gives him money for whatever purposes he needs. In fact, one of the purposes he needed it for was the 1941 special election for the Senate that Johnson enters and eventually loses. But the IRS gets wind of some of these illegal campaign contributions, and they're starting to investigate all of this. And Johnson is aware of it. He goes to the Secretary of the Treasury to try to get the investigation stopped. Secretary of Treasury won't do it, and he appeals to Roosevelt again, and Roosevelt stops the investigation. Without that action, Johnson could have become, history a lot sooner, and his career could have been over much sooner.
And potentially that whole investigation could have led its way up to FDR as well, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that worked out well for both of them, didn't it?
It definitely did. And even in 1940, we talked about Roosevelt's third term. So Johnson is wanting to run for re-election, but we talked about he's serving as a double agent essentially, and against John Nance Garner. Garner suspects something is going on, and so he talks to the postmaster in Johnson's district in Texas to drum up some opposition to Johnson's campaign for another term. Johnson gets wind of it, tries to get the postmaster fired. No success. Has to go to FDR again. FDR eventually fires the postmaster, and Johnson has no opposition for that term. So you've got these points in time in their careers where they are really helping each other out, and where if they had not had that political partnership and friendship, things would have turned out very differently.
Yeah, when I read the book and I was comparing the two friendships, the Taft and Roosevelt versus Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt, I felt that with Teddy and William Taft, it seemed like they just, I don't know, I got a sense that there was a really warm friendship. And then when the politics got involved and the ego of TR, that sort of started to split it. And Taft was a very unwilling participant in the mudslinging and all that stuff. And of course, they became pretty much enemies, and then sort of lukewarm sort of friends at the end. Now, of course, FDR dies in the April of 1945. And at that time, he and LBJ were still friends. But I get a sense that it was more about what they could do for each other, period.
It was a partnership of political convenience. Certainly they liked each other. They saw in each other themselves, and they liked each other, but it was never the warm personal friendship that Taft and Theodore Roosevelt had. And there were times in this, short 8-year period where FDR and LBJ intersected with one another, where FDR didn't need anything from LBJ, and LBJ couldn't get into the White House to talk to the president. And so that kind of illustrates your point that this was not a warm personal friendship. They didn't just sit together to chat. It was more, what can I do for you? What can you do for me?
Yeah. And let's talk about how the FDR LBJ friendship changed history. So perhaps FDR wouldn't have been reelected in 1940. How would that have affected United States involvement in World War II? I know FDR was very conscious about the isolationist feelings in the United States and political ramifications of helping Great Britain. If FDR had not been reelected, what would have happened in the White House,
Things would have been very, very different, and history has these potential ripple effects then, without an FDR, there's no Harry Truman, who is now, rated by presidential scholars as one of the best presidents. So yes, the changes would have been immense without FDR winning.
And here's one for you. I'm going to throw you this little zinger. See how you do with this one, Mike.
Okay.
How did knowing FDR and working with FDR change or make LBJ's career later when he became president? What kind of an effect do you think FDR's friendship had on LBJ, the president?
I think it probably reinforced for LBJ some of his natural tendencies at desiring to be at the center of attention, to exercise power, because he saw the master do that. And FDR was clearly a master at that. I think that Johnson picked up a lot of tips from Franklin Roosevelt along the way and reinforced his natural tendencies, his natural patterns, and he continued to do that. I think also surprisingly, you've got this, aristocratic Franklin Roosevelt, who's very much a president of the people and concerned about the people. And of course, he had a major voice in his wife, Eleanor, who was his eyes and ears, and she would help push him in certain directions. And then you've got Lyndon Johnson, who knew what it was like to be poor and wanted to do good. So it starts with, the electricity in the hill country, and then that comes to full bloom in the great society of his presidency.
Yes. I was going to say that as well, but also I think about FDR's handling of the war, World War II, and how maybe LBJ is sadly known for mishandling the Vietnam War. I mean, there's a lot more to it and to study about it, but certainly we see the escalation of the war in Vietnam, and you wonder, was there anything from knowing FDR that affected the way that LBJ handled our involvement in Vietnam? That's a really hard one to call, I think.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, clearly Johnson was able to see FDR's wartime leadership, and yet the Vietnam War became Johnson's Achilles heel. And it was the one thing in life that he could not control or handle, or you could say he made some mistakes on, that he just, I think that was outside of his realm. He was so intent on climbing the political ladder, exercising power, but then when he got to the ultimate test of the Vietnam War, he kind of crumbled.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, this is a Wonderful book, Mike, Presidential Friendships, How They Changed History. I know that you have studied other presidential friendships. There's one that I think about all the time is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. I think of them a lot more like the Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. They were really true good friends. And then politics became really a sticking point for both of them. And even though, from what I know, presidential candidates didn't really campaign themselves back then, it got vicious and it got nasty. But they did become very warm friends, unlike TR and Taft, who were sort of maybe lukewarm. It seems that through letters, Jefferson and Adams got to become very good friends again, which was nice to think of. But maybe that's for your next book.
Yes, it's one of the things I'd like to do, and it is a very heartwarming story about the Adams Jefferson reconciliation. And one of the things I'd like to do is go back and really study those roughly 17 years after their presidencies when they wrote these letters to one another, and to see what is in there in terms of warmth versus simply talking about political issues of the day. But they clearly engaged with one another again. And it's something that started when, encouraged on by Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Adams writes to Jefferson to open up the door to a reconciliation. And he says, "You and I ought not to die until we have explained ourselves to one another." And I just think that's a wonderful catchphrase for us to think about today in our polarized society. How do we explain ourselves to one another? And how do we have civil conversations where we disagree politically?
I'm so glad you said that, because that was going to be my last question to you. How do you think that this book and studying these friendships can be applied to today's very divisive political environment? I mean, you've got holiday get-togethers with family that are, you got to stay off certain topics because there's going to be, fights and arguments. Can't you have a discussion and explain yourselves to each other and just have the other person listen?
Right, right. And my hope is that people reading the book may think more deeply about the pivotal role of friendships in our lives, and whether it's around the family dinner table or whatever, that we recognize that our relationships with one another make a difference, not only in our personal worlds, our small personal world, but in the broader political world. And of course, my hope is that political leaders might end up reading this and thinking about, how do we establish friendships? How do we act with civility toward one another? And so that's my hope, that we might learn from this, both at a personal level and a political level.
Well said, Mike. Well said. And other than writing about additional presidential friendships, what else do you have on the drawing board?
Well, I have a book that is coming out in a couple of months that is not presidential at all, but it's entitled Reflections of an Uncertain Journey. And it's a personal memoir of mine, talking about my journey over the last 3.5, almost 4 years, since I was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer, and the impact on that journey for me, physically. What has that meant in terms of treatments, emotionally, spiritually, the role of companions for the journey, good friends to accompany you. I talk about the role of legacy, which is something I think about a lot. And how do we move forward in the midst of uncertainty? Because all of our lives are uncertain. There's things we cannot control. So it's my hope that the book might help people, whether they have a cancer journey or just some other kind of uncertainty, to think more broadly about, how do we manage and handle life when things don't go well.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you're writing that book. I think so many people will benefit from reading it, including myself. Thank you for your work. You write so beautifully. I just zipped through your book. How can somebody get a hold of a copy of Presidential Friendships?
So Presidential Friendships is available pretty much wherever you get your books. You can get a copy of it.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Mike, for being on Your History, Your Story. And you're just a great storyteller, and you really know your stuff, I'll tell you. So thank you for all the incredible amount of research that you've done and reflection on what you've read and studied, and for all you do for history in this society and in this culture. I think it's great.
Well, thank you, James, for your kind comments. And it's an honor to be here on your podcast. And I appreciate it very much and enjoyed the conversation with you.
And we're going to talk real soon because I want to talk to you about your next book, too.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, Mike, have a great night.
Okay, you too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care, James. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.